Well, we have a quorum, so we'll call the meeting to order at 4:32. There are any public comment cards? Seeing none. We'll call. We see all members present other than Dare Holdren, Ken Rivas, and Diana Pereira. So how do you say her last name? Herrera.
I think so.
Herrera. If they come in, we'll make note. And so that will take us to the Department Reserve Board policy discussion. All right.
Okay, thank you,
Anything
Bill.
else before then?
I just want to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded through the TV in the bar over there, and it will be posted after the meeting on the website for public consumption. So we will dive right in. You see our agenda doesn't have a lot of items, but we have a very important item to discuss based on a desire from the board to discuss a board policy regarding district reserves. And so that is our first topic. I like to put the ones we want to make sure we cover first, because sometimes we don't get to too many things after that. Our discussions are usually good and hearty. So we also have, I had sent out prior a couple items on the budget and Tran. If we get a few minutes to talk about those at the end, we will. But we will jump right into the reserves. And so I want to make sure to orient people to district reserves and kind of have an idea of what the breadth of information and what a district reserve is all about, how we calculate it before we kind of dive into a conversation on the why and how and what our goal really is going to be. If you were able to listen to the board meeting last time, the direction was for the finance committee to kind of take this topic and discuss, because I think the goal is the board wants to decide, do we need to update the language in board policy? There is a board policy, I sent it, it's attached to the agenda, 3100 I believe it is, that directly discusses overall budget, and there's a section there about reserves. So I'll present a little information and then we'll kind of start the conversation as we go through it. If there's any questions, please feel free to just raise your hand or interrupt or whatever works. And I did send out a couple articles. Thank you, Celeste, provided an article from the Government Finance Officers Association. And I found another one from the Legislative Analyst's Office. It was about 10 years old, but I think the most of that is still very applicable for school districts in California as it relates to reserves. So the reserves are pretty much kind of cash in the bank. They're kind of our equity. It's what do we have to support the organization? What's our kind of the money we have cash in the bank? And from one of the articles, I believe it's the LAO, kind of identified 5 reasons that you would have a reserve. A district needs a reserve. Number 1, manage cash flow. And we talked about that when we had the TRAN discussion, the tax revenue anticipation note. If you've got a big reserve and lots of cash in the bank, you don't need to do short-term borrowing throughout the year, because being a basic aid district, we get the biggest chunks of our revenue in December and April, when property taxes are collected by the county and then distributed out to school districts. So having a reserve helps you manage cash flow to make sure we have enough cash in the bank to get us through those leaner months. The second item here is to mitigate the volatility in funding and expenditures. And so we've seen in the past, the state will say in December, sorry, we're not going to give you all the money we said we were going to give you. We're only going to give you half. For a lot of districts that aren't basic aid districts, that could be very troublesome as they're expecting their full allocation. And if they don't, then they have to make mid-year cuts. So even a basic aid district, if something big happened that we had to repair 5 roofs at schools that were millions and millions of dollars, you would use your cash in the bank to really help cover those costs. And if loss in funding, we've talked about with property taxes, very stable right here in Santa Barbara for now, but if you've lived here long enough, There have been big fires, mud flows that just sweep, property taxes right off the lot. And so there are things in our funding and property taxes that could be cause some risk for us that we may not collect all of those. I think for the most part, it's a very stable form of revenue, but you never know what could happen throughout the year. And address unexpected costs. That was kind of the roof example, but it could be anything. Big unexpected costs, especially in your private life, it's like you own your home and you need to replace your roof and it's going to be $50,000. Like, how are you going to pay for that? So having a good reserve can help with those kind of things, and saving for large purchases. A good example would be a new curriculum, a new math curriculum for the entire district would cost millions of dollars to have if we did it from kindergarten through 12th grade. And so you save money for those in your reserve to use for one-time big purchases. And also the impact you can see as a reduced cost of borrowing money. So when districts borrow money by issuing bonds and issuing notes, and what the rating agencies will do is come in and look at all of your financial information, how much money you have in the bank, what are your revenues and expenditures, how good are your cash flows. So having a good reserve will get us the best rating we can if and when we go out for a bond, which is very important. So if you see here, the table on the right, I kind of pulled and kind of created because it kind of shows you kind of red, yellow, green, and blue. Red is that critical level of your reserve falls below 3%. It triggers Santa Barbara County Education Office oversight and all kinds of budgetary qualifications and issues and problems that really can be difficult going forward. So 3% is that bare minimum. You never want to get near 3% or especially go below 3%. That's why it's red. Yellow, there he is, hey Ken. Good to see you, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Got the record. No, Ken Rivas is on the scene.
In the house.
Thanks for coming. And so the area where we are as a district right now is we're in the yellow. And so yellow is anywhere from 3 to 10%. It meets the minimum level, but thanks to Fund 17 for us, it really keeps us in that yellow. If we didn't have our Fund 17 as a separate fund that we keep as a cash reserve, what's there, about $16 million in Fund 17? So that has really kept us where we need to be, keeps us out of the red. I think some of the target areas we've talked about are the green, and that's a kind of a healthy level. And I think right at the top end of the green would really keep us from having to issue a TRAN every year. It would cover our cash flow throughout the year, 10 to 15%. And RU is reserved for economic uncertainty. That's what the state calls it. The bare minimum is the 3%, but that economic uncertainty kind of plays all throughout here. And then the blue, over 15%, is the optimal according to GFOA and according to any of the analysts that you'll see from the financial side. Districts should have over 15%, whether you're community funded basic aid or not. It aligns with that GFOA recommended standard of greater than 2 months of expenditures. And for us, 2 months of expenditures is about 38 million, I believe, 38, 39 million, depending on the months. And it really helps you provide resilience against inflation and unexpected costs. But there are some challenges in maintaining a reserve above 15%. Competing interests, for programs and costs and wage increases, all those things. And so if you can get above 15% and stay above 15%, that is very ideal from a financial side. And so we've had this conversation before. And so I figured this graphical representation kind of shows you the different levels, and I kind of put them into categories of what makes sense for a reserve. And so here I kind of wanted to step through the calculation of how we come up with this. This is from our adopted budget, and I will share these slides with everybody. Sorry, I just kind of finished them about an hour ago, but I will get them out to you. All of this information is information that you've seen before, has either been in the articles and the information that was attached or in some other document that has been made publicly available. And so this is our multi-year projection that we had in our adopted budget. This first column is the year we're just about to start. This is the following year and the year after that. In a multi-year projection, we always do 3 years. That's pretty standard procedure. And so beginning fund balance here is 22.8 million. We're planning to take in 253 million in revenues and spend 263 million going out. And it shows a total deficit of 9.7 million. And so our ending fund balance would be the difference of all of that. You take the beginning, add the revenue, take out the expenditures, and that's 13 million in the general fund. Of that 13 million, 11 million is restricted. And so when you're trying to figure out how much reserve, unrestricted reserve we have, you have to take out the restricted pieces. These are carryover from various programs, Title I, II, III, any of those state or federal restricted programs. And so we also, you see here, this 1,786,000 we've assigned in our reserve. So we've also taken that off the top. That is for the 7th period, adding 7th period to the junior highs next year. We said that was, we would kind of reserve that, we call it assign it, so that it's not part of the overall reserve calculation. So with all of that, it leaves a very small 288,000 in Fund 1. And so that's just Fund 1. Yes, Les.
Why do we have a Fund 17? What is Fund 17?
So I don't know when it started, a number of years back. There was probably some money that came in or through some policy or procedure that the district, it's been there as long as I can remember. I looked to Lacey, it's been there at least 15 years, I would say.
I mean, why not just have an unrestricted and restricted reserve? What is the utility of Fund 17? Do we spend?
We don't have to have the fund.
What is?
It just sits there earning interest. And so it is our true unrestricted reserve. So at any point, we could move the whole thing to Fund 1. If the board would rather see it all into Fund 1, we could move it to Fund 1 and close Fund 17.
It's like having a savings.
But isn't that what our reserves are? I mean,
But
not a savings.
But I mean, so like in your personal life, like do you keep everything in your checking account or do you have your reserve in your savings account? So it's similar to that sort of situation.
Yeah. And so that's why we add it back in here. We take the 288, we add back in the balance, the 16.3 for the total reserve available, the unrestricted available is the 16.6 million. And so to get the percentage, you take that and because the reserve is the percentage is a percent of total expenditures. So you take that and you divide it by the 263 million in expenditures to get the percent of 6.32% for this year. And we see that next year, if things stay the way they are, which they won't, then we have that same calculation running through here. And if you could see, Fund 17 goes up by about 300,000, and that's due to the interest that it's earning in that fund. And so then we go to 6.04%. And then the third year out, we see that we have essentially balanced the budget and spent down a lot of the restricted, going from 11 to 6 million. And so we are then start moving up to 7.17%. The key to this, I just wanted to show you how it flows and how the calculation is done. Basically, you take the total unrestricted reserve amount and you divide it by the total expenditure.
Connor, just a quick question on the 27-28, the negative 640,000 Fund 1.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't that just zeroed out and money pulled from 17?
It would be.
So that's just, this is just like pre that.
Right, because the multi-year projection isn't an official budget for each of those years.
So it's final.
Right, and I think showing it as negative really shows, we don't want to hide that. We want to kind of show you what's happening there. And then so as we need this Fund 17, we will transfer it out because we don't want to have a negative balance in there. And we'll start looking at that to see how much of that Fund 17 we should transfer over and when.
Is there a state regulation causing the requirement for Fund 17?
No,
Does it earn more interest than Fund 1?
it earns the same percent, it earns the same amount. It could very well be in Fund 1, and then it would save the extra lines on this report. But like Lacey was saying, it's like, you have that money in the savings account, let's try to make it work without digging that.
Try not to use it.
Trying not to use it, right? Trying not to use it. And I think as we look at our budgeting and we look at our planning, we should try to fix this without using too much of that. Because I think from a budgetary goal, I think we'll be working with the board and this committee and everybody to really, how can we fix this without digging too deep into that? But if we had something come up like a big program that we had to get started, really wanted to get started, a one-time thing we needed to do, we would dig into that. We would transfer that over. But it's kind of a one-time amount that's sitting in that savings
Wait,
account.
you may have said this, so that if you did do that, where you pulled out money for something, then do you then look at figuring out how to put more money back in? Like, how do you decide?
It works the same way as it would at home.
Okay.
Like you take out of your savings, you want to put it back if you can. You needed to, you wanted to get a new car, so you pulled that money out, and then you're going to try to put the money, try to build it up again for when your spouse needs a new car or when your kid needs it. So you'll start to try to keep saving. Not all districts have a Fund 17. I would probably say more don't than do. When I was in Goleta, we didn't have a Fund 17. It was all sitting in Fund 1. It's kind of nice to see. It's a nice feel to have it there, to really get a look, to make sure we keep on track of what's really happening in Fund 1 without it. But there will be a time where we need to start transferring that over. Like Todd was saying, we get to toward the end of the year here, we will be transferring that money over to cover any shortfall.
But it is an actual transfer as opposed to let's just use the balance that's sitting in the bottom of Fund 1.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got it in the checking account so I can spend it as opposed to, oh, I need to move this from the savings to the checking. It's a reality check.
Reality check, absolutely. So does this kind of make sense to the group, how that calculation is done? The main thing is like, where does that percent come from? Because we always talk about the percent. And so what'll happen too is if you can have the same dollar amount in the reserve, if the total expenditure number changes, the reserve percentage is going to change. If it goes up or down, that same dollar amount can result in a different percentage because of the fluctuation in expenditures.
And I think, Conrad, on that point, one interesting factor to think about is each point of reserve is $2.6 million. So as you think about wanting to increase or decrease the reserves, you can just, in the back of your mind, so that's $2.6 million. So if we're going to lose $9.7 million or the $9.7 million deficit, that's like 3 points of reserve that were spent to fund that deficit.
Once you adjust for the restricted, what's restricted, what's unrestricted, and all that comes through. But then you're right. And when we talk about the 2 months of expenditures, you can see in year 3, the total reserve is 19 million. So you figure that's 7%. If we say we spend 19 million a month, so to have 2 months of expenditures in reserve, we would need 14% in a reserve, essentially. If our goal was to say we need to have enough in reserve to cover 2 months of expenditures, based on this, it would be about 14%.
I don't know if I'm understanding the board policy correctly, but it seems like it's saying that we wouldn't be in unless there's a way to something waived, we wouldn't be in excess of 10%? Does that mean that we would, like on your chart where we have the red, are we ideally looking to be
So the red,
in
yellow.
the green?
So I think and that's part of the conversation, is where do we really want to get to?
Or actually in the,
Ideally, you want to be in the blue.
okay. But
Right.
yeah.
But the conversation and the competing interests for spending, you got to get to green before you get to blue. And how much are you willing to cut out of your budget to get to the blue? And is it really worth what you're trying to do just to get to the blue?
Right.
And so there's all of that conversation as far as budget building to set a goal to be in the blue. Well, result in kind of drastic reductions to get us there if you tried to do it in 1 year. But if you work on a plan over 3 to 5 years to work to the blue, you have to factor in negotiated settlements and increased costs and curriculum, all those things. How do we inch our way to the blue while not going back to close to red? Because we're about 6%, so we're kind of right there in the middle of the yellow. But I think the target area is the yellow for now.
I suppose you could also have the conversation around, like, it's important to have that in the reserve, but and balancing that with, are we spending the money that we should be spending
Right.
for students and staff?
Absolutely.
And not holding,
Yeah,
right?
that's the biggest challenge. You summed it up right there. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there's more, is there more before the discussion?
I just kind of put the language, I wanted to highlight what's already in the budget policy. And so that was attached, that was sent to you. I don't need to read through it. But this is the piece that, I kind of referred to at the board meeting. It's a little vague, but it shows a goal, but it's not specific, intends to maintain a minimum assigned and unassigned fund balance in an amount the board deems sufficient to maintain fiscal solvency and stability and to protect the district against unforeseen circumstances. That's what's in there right now.
Is an assigned fund balance the same thing as a restricted funds?
No,
That's what the assigned is, like the money that.
for the 7th period day, yeah. And I actually back out it says minimum assigned and unassigned. But yeah, I don't include assigned.
Then is the restricted fund balance then another type of assignment? Because it's for money for things that have to be spent on a certain thing, right?
Correct.
In a certain timeline and that
Correct.
kind of stuff. So in reality, that number is not unrestricted and not available for consideration for other expenses. It's really locked in, almost like a savings account that would be maybe a certificate of deposit where you can't get it out, right?
And back to if a roof caved in, I couldn't use Title I to fix it. Because all of those restricted accounts have specific guidelines and requirements that you can spend them on or not. Some of those you can borrow from and pay back, but they're all part of the general fund like cash balance. But yeah, they don't go into that reserve calculation.
But they do cover real expenses that are part of the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Labor and things like
Absolutely.
that, just labor-specific for program A versus program B. So
Some-
I think it's relevant to include it in the bigger picture.
Absolutely, but what portion of the restricted reserve is ongoing expense versus one-time expense? I'm not looking for the answer, it's a
Right.
rhetorical question. I'm presuming that there's some of each in the restricted balance, right?
Right. Ideally, restricted, we shouldn't have much in restricted fund balance because unless it's a one-time thing. But like with Title I, I'll use that example. That is set to run programs to service specific students and should be spent each year. And so there shouldn't be big balances in there because you should have programs sufficient to use that money each year.
Right.
But then again, that money can fluctuate based on, they want you to spend it each year. They only give you 2 years or whatever, 24 months, 18 months, whatever it is. And it can decline if your student population in a certain area declines and your Title I funding declines. And so spending it all right away, it can present its own set of challenges. And another example is that block grant that I brought to the board last meeting to say we have this new student support block grant where it's a one-time thing. They're giving us about $10 million to use as we see fit, but it's one-time money and it's not the kind of money you want to hire a bunch of positions because then the next year when it's gone, there's no ongoing revenue to support it. But also it may take 2 or 3 years to spend it all. They give us, I think that one until 2029 to spend that one. So some of those balances you will see there over time. Take a little time.
Will that be booked as an unrestricted reserve?
No, that's a restricted.
So that would be a restricted
That is
reserve.
still restricted, yeah.
But okay.
It can be used for just about anything, which is interesting because it's a discretionary restricted reserve, which is kind of contrary to itself, but that's how it's stated.
Well, it's good we have it because the restricted account has a massive deficit, right?
Right.
So like, it's great to have that.
It'll support that, almost gets rid of the deficit entirely, just that 9.7 million. If we got 10 million in that restricted account, you would potentially see that deficit be gone. That's why when you peel back the layers, there's more to it. It's not like, yay, the deficit's gone, we can move on. It's an ongoing.
But the accounting would be, it's booked as a 10 million restricted reserve, and then as you spend it, it would show up as a revenue and an expense.
No, it'll show up just as an
Only-
expense.
Just as expense.
Yeah, they have us record all the revenue in the 1 year.
So the
and then-
10 million will show up as a restricted reserve and a revenue.
Right.
Okay.
And then we spend it down, and that's what creates the deficit. Because next year, when we spend 5 million, there's no revenue there to match with it, so it shows as a deficit.
But there's
Sure.
not really a restricted deficit per se,
Yeah,
because you can't spend more than you've got. So a true deficit is covered by unrestricted at the end of the day.
Mhm.
But I think.
it just takes some time to spend it all now from an
Yeah.
accounting entry.
Yeah,
It
looks
doesn't-
negative, but it's not.
It doesn't fit the matching principle. Celeste.
I'm curious, so I was reading the GFOA paper, Rethinking Reserves, and it talks a lot about changing mental models from the savings account mode of reserves to the self-insurance mode, like that reserves are really there for disasters and in recessions to smooth basically like revenue decline so we can continue to have robust programs.
Right.
So I'm curious of how, if we've talked at all about kind of reserves as insurance, as self-insurance, and how we think about that in conjunction with our commercial insurance, because I know you mentioned like competing priorities, but when you think of reserves as the way that our district continues to function if we have a true disaster, that's a very different model than a savings account that we use reserves for, like a roof falling in.
Mhm.
So
I thought it was a great article. I
Yeah.
read it, and what I
Yeah.
liked about that analysis, and the article said it should be a combination of both the
Yes.
savings
Yes.
account mentality and the insurance mentality. What I liked about the insurance thing is they brought the concept of risk weighting
Right.
yes,
to the budget, if you will. And so risk weightings to the different revenue streams, I think we could look at, this revenue stream is a very low risk of being much different than our projection versus another revenue stream might be like, we could be 20% off either way, and same on expenses. But I think we can add, as we think about reserving, we can look at the budget and try and get a sense of probabilities of risk of those revenues showing up or not, or those expenses overrunning. I think that was a good thing. And then adding into what you say about these low probability but high cost things that can happen, floods, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And those are big ticket, you can add that into it as well.
I mean, what I thought was interesting about this analysis is basically I like the idea of doing a risk-based reserve analysis, and that it could kind of give us a more quantitative way of figuring out where our reserve should be, and also like a window. So it's not like one point, but within, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I actually pulled this next slide from that article, because it kind of talks about some of the, what should you address when you're developing that policy, and it's like, why should you be accumulating? Like in your policy, it should be clear as to why, when we add that policy, what is the reason that we feel like it should be 15%? And clearly kind of explain that out, how much should be accumulated. And they also talked about it doesn't necessarily have to be one number, it can be a range, which is a reasonable way to look at it. And what strategies should be used for accumulation, which gets into the depth of the budget development process of, okay, each year, like when you take your monthly pay and you say, I'm gonna take 4% and put that in savings. It's the same kind of concept. And then when and for what purposes reserves can be used. And so like when you build up that reserve, what are some of the kind of things that could trigger a withdrawal from your reserve? So all of those things are important things to look at as you're putting policy language together. if you think about it, a couple of years back, I think we were close to 20% in the reserve. I believe 19%, 3 years ago. And the board decided, for good reason, to increase our salary schedules for a big part in that, and that's what it was used for. The problem is we've talked about that before, that helps in year one and helps in year two, but we really have to then go back to how we budget to make sure we can accommodate that significant change in year 3 and 4 and 5. Yeah,
So-
long term.
I mean, I think that the idea of the window is an interesting point based on what you're saying, because also you have a min and a max, and if you're getting beyond or close to your max, your reserves are too high, and you should be, I mean, it deals with that problem, like, the kind of healthy range your reserve should be in, but perhaps you have in your reserve policy that your reserves can't be used for ongoing expenses, except in, let's say, a particular situation like recession. I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but
Yeah.
I was thinking about that min and max, because I think that's the right way to go. And one way to think about it, the min would be where you could set, the board is looking for fiscal stability and sustainability, right? Maybe that's what we need to determine what that min is. That will keep us at that level. And then the max is more, we hope to someday get there, but it's not necessarily something that's achievable short.
I mean, I guess my question for everyone is, well, I guess I think of the min and max a little differently. Like if we did a risk analysis, the min and max would be like, min is higher risk, lower self-insurance versus max
Okay,
is,
definitely.
you know what I mean? But because we're at a place right now where we're way below, where we're in the yellow basically, like we might need to have kind of, I don't know, a policy that helps us get to a point where we achieve the min and the max. So I wouldn't want the min to be too low because then we can peak her again. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's like last week when I made a comment to the board to bring into this the concept of also a balanced budget. Because if we keep on running a deficit, the reserves will keep just going down,
Right.
right? And so until we actually start having accumulation, we can't have it until we have a surplus. Right, and the last time we did was 22, 23, actually, we didn't draw down 0 reserves, unrestricted or restricted, because we had a surplus, our reserves went up, right? And so I think for us all to consider is maybe the combination of setting those reserves min and max with the concept of maybe pushing for some sort of budget balance, target, or goal. I think they're linked, and I don't think you can have one without the other.
At this point, we have to not just get the balanced budget, we have
We
to
have
have
to do surplus.
excess. So we went from
Yeah, I'm thinking big
5
steps.
years of negatives, to now we have to have a surplus for so many years just to get to what a minimum reasonable level is gonna look like. And so we're talking 10 years, realistically, to get to something reasonable. We've got 3 more years of negatives, and we got how many more years, 5 or 7 to build up to it, because we're not gonna have 3-4
Yeah, so
million in
you're
surplus
making
every
that same point, like at a minimum should be a balanced budget, right? It should be a surplus.
And then we start building in a small surplus, and I don't know if we can invest 16 million or 17 million or not, but maybe some rules
Interesting
around
point,
that,
yeah.
because we should be making a lot more than $300,000 a year on 16 million. But there could be some restrictions
Yeah.
around that, but we should, $1 million would be reasonable, super low risk, fixed income type things.
Yeah, so are we using the reserves each year to balance the budget?
We have been.
We have
Yeah,
been.
no
And
choice.
it's to do, yeah, because the expenditures now have been more than the revenues. Now, a good chunk of that have been restricted reserves paying down restricted reserve, using those reserves, using more restricted reserve dollars than the revenues that are coming in. So that's a chunk of it. I mean, we went from 20 million in restricted reserves last year to now we're down to 10. So, but that shows up in a big way. But even on the unrestricted side, we're still facing a $5 million deficit this year.
So what, Todd, you're speaking to when you're talking about, figuring out a min and a max, you're talking about the unrestricted monies?
The whole unrestricted and restricted, because
Okay.
when the restricted runs a deficit, it has to be made whole by unrestricted. So like, these are the numbers, like for.
Yeah, but that's a little bit of a nuance, Todd, because of the way that 10 million gets counted up front, so it looks like a deficit, but it's not really on that restricted.
So I just go, these are the numbers, like, so the restricted and the unrestricted account ran a 20 million surplus. But the restricted ran a 40 million deficit, so the combined for this last year was a $20.6 million deficit. So to pay for that $20.25 million surplus from the unrestricted would pay for part of the restricted. And then 8.9 million of restricted reserves we utilized. But then that caused us to use 11.6 million of unrestricted reserves.
Yeah, I mean, we are getting into our unrestricted reserves, but.
Right, so like,
Sure.
the point being is I think you have to, I think you have to look at everything, because
So I think it's
ultimately,
presentation.
the unrestricted has to pay for it.
Agreed. I think the presentation could be a little different, so there's the gas presentation that's required, which is what we have to see. But there's another, I call it the kind of the management version, where you have the restricted. So we get 10 million up front, but we spend it over 3 years.
Yep.
It's not GAAP, but we're showing that it's 10 million, but it's actually 3, 3, and 4 or
Sure.
something.
Yep.
So that it doesn't look like there's these big negatives, and we can see how much is actually being pulled. So again, it's some of the public companies do this where they have their GAAP financials, and then they specifically have other financials that say these are not GAAP, these are deviants, but it's because we need to show something and explain it. And I use this a lot to just modify, because I think it can be confusing to have these negatives. But
We have like 3 years in a row of
We've got three-
significant
yes,
negatives.
we do, we're a little on the extreme side.
Right.
And some of those restricted dollars, I think, could have been used because we're using all the restricted, but if.
That's the goal.
But if we didn't have to
Restricted money
use it, we
first.
could have used that for other programs.
If you want, I actually made, this is an interesting thing we can look at, it's unrestricted, restricted, it's spending of the reserves and all that sort of stuff.
But as we look at the numbers, I'm really interested in bullet point 3 about, just for a second, what strategy should we use for accumulation? Because I'm interested in how we can accumulate this to figure out how that's gonna happen, so we come up with your min and max. Because we need to accumulate it in order for it to keep going.
So that means revenue.
And we
has to
can't
exceed
accumulate
expenses.
until we run a surplus.
I mean, to me, it seems like it's two conversations, like,
Yeah.
I think you're right, we need to have a balanced budget and separately do a risk analysis to figure out what our reserve level should be in an ideal world. But then the question is how we get there, and we need to figure out how we accumulate enough. So, I mean, we can work on board policy with ideal min and max, but the issue is, in order to get there, to Ken's point and Todd, Diana's point, we need a balanced budget.
Let me ask a couple questions and see some clarification. I do think that there's so much technical language around this that we have risk of misunderstanding. And I think your comment about the nuances of the restricted funds and the fact that it's still a deficit, it's a deficit. I think that's a piece that needs some more clarity for us. I'm gonna ask a question that will show my level of ignorance about it and maybe lead us in a different direction. Conrad, you say that when we receive restricted funds, it shows up in the year that it's received.
Correct.
And our goal
Not
is,
for all, for some.
let's use the example of one that is that way,
A
okay?
block grant, yeah.
So a block grant that's there, and let's just say it's $1 million, and you spend half of it.
Mhm.
And the next year, what does it look like the next year?
Can I pause right there? So theoretically, if that's true, there should be, so 10 million comes in, we spend 1, there should be a $9 million surplus because we didn't spend on that year.
Right, in that
In
year.
that year,
And then-
which should then roll forward,
If you roll it
but we
forward,
have no surpluses, and that's the challenge. We have
but
no-
that's the surplus, those restricted accounts that have those surpluses are rolled into all of this and go into the restricted balance, right? That restricted.
Yep.
The big dollar, right there was 11 million in the current year. That's restricted money left over from prior year. That in order to spend that, for the most part, you will see a deficit. If we spent it all next year, it would be $11 million in deficit. Not paid for by unrestricted, it would be $11 million. In the example of the 10 million, we got it this year, and we spent 1 million this year. Next year, if we spent the other 9, we'd have a $9 million deficit.
But we didn't really, because we had the surplus.
Where does
And so we don't
the,
see the surplus on here, and that's where I'm saying it looks,
where does the
Right.
where does the 9 million or $9 million show up the next year? Does it show up as a restricted?
It's in the restricted reserve until you spend it. And if we budget to spend it, all 9 million, it's in the total expenditures line, right? Because you're budgeting to spend the 9 million.
So if
So it
you-
all shows up in the expenditure line and disappears from the restricted reserve.
Okay, so if you see dramatic changes in total expenditures, some of it may be based on subsequent years of restricted money that was there.
Right, like the arts, music, instructional materials block grant. We spent the rest of it this year and it's all gone. But that was 6 million or 5 million spent last year from revenues that came 4 years ago. And so then that's, so your expenditures are almost inflated by the 4 or 5 million because you're spending down that one-time money.
so what happens is our expenses have been solid. So unless we get new restricted money or
Right.
unrestricted, that's where that deficit is gonna be harder to
Right.
close.
Right. And so that's why sometimes you won't see it because it's layers on top of layers of, we spent that 9 million, but we got 9 million more, so it looks like a net zero thing, but that's an $18 million
So this is
transaction.
confusing with every single organization I work with that has lots of restricted and unrestricted funds, which is why there's a separate management report
Right,
specific to this, because it is confusing, even for accountants, not that it's confusing for us. but
Right.
it's like, there's moving pieces.
Or what is what you're saying that then there would be a breaking out of the total expenditures to be from
Uh-huh.
restricted and unrestricted, so
And what's coming in this year versus what's rolling forward specifically, because
that
we need
makes
to know.
sense.
Yeah,
We've got
Appreciate it.
11 million this year.
So Karen, can I, like, on this document that I made, can you help us walk through, like, this year, or 25, 26? These are real numbers, and so it's a 48.8 million deficit for the restricted. But we only utilized 8.9 million of restricted reserves. So we had to utilize 28.2 million of unrestricted surplus, 11.6 million of unrestricted reserves. So like in this matching concept of like, as you run it through expenses, then the reserve goes down, that's a matching. For some reason, how do we have 40 million in deficit, but
so
we only utilize 8.9 million of reserve?
there's 2 main programs restricted programs that are supported by unrestricted. That's special education and routine restricted maintenance, right? The rest of it is just spending down what's there. So I don't know quite how to answer your question, Todd, because I really have to dig in to what these are. But what I'm definitely hearing is I need to come up with a better way to bring this back to the board and to this committee to really get into that detail of what you're talking about, kind of a separate statement that clarifies that.
Or what I send is, it's a
I mean, in the
simple
budget
version.
book, we have the combined restricted and unrestricted general fund. There's also a schedule that's unrestricted general fund and restricted general. So we split it out the 3 ways. It's all in there, but seeing all the pieces that are in there, and it's not a multi-year projection. It's only the 1 year is what we do that for.
So it seems for the reserve, whether it's min and max or insurance or savings or whatever it looks like, the restricted balance is really not relevant to it.
Right.
Right?
Right. It gets into the bigger conversation of where we are as a district, but for policy, for what this agenda item is, it's like we need to kind of step back from the restricted piece and kind of really focus on the unrestricted what is that, what would that policy look like?
Right, it's almost as if they're completely separate animals with restricted and unrestricted. And when we talk about combining them and then setting a reserve level that's combined for them.
Right.
There's an awful lot of deviance gonna be in depending on what kind of, the way the money's being coming in.
So the policy should focus on the unrestricted.
Right.
That's what the policy is.
Thank you.
Just unrestricted.
And that brings.
And the ebbs and flows of the restricted will happen, and sometimes it will draw from unrestricted for those programs, special ed, maintenance, there may be one or two others. But the focus is really on us as a district operating, financials of the unrestricted piece.
And if I can say one caveat though, it's like, so I get it, like the 6.3%, it's only an unrestricted, right? So.
Yeah.
The one thing, and this came actually out of the document that's less than around in terms of those other funds, and are there draws on the unrestricted that aren't being covered, and so that's what's happening in the restricted right now. And so when you look at this, like 54% of total reserve spent in last year were from unrestricted, 56% this year, 61. So when you look at it, like because of the very large deficits in the restricted account, we're having to pull from unrestricted significant amounts of unrestricted reserves. So you see like 9.6 million last year, 11.6 million this year, pulling from unrestricted reserves. So that's why I'm saying we still can't ignore unrestricted because, restricted, because we're having to pull so much money from unrestricted.
But it's actually, the restricted is not in a deficit, it can't be
Oh,
in a
no, I get
deficit.
it. Oh, I get it, that's.
We are overspending generally, and
That's why we're pulling the surplus from
Well,
unrestricted.
Yeah.
if we use the example of special education, okay, there's money that comes in for special education that's restricted funding for special education.
Right.
It's never enough to cover the cost of special
Not even
education.
close.
So that is the kind of thing you're talking about. That is drawing from unrestricted reserve.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's a program, it's a program that we have to have.
Mhm.
It's funded at a level lower than the federal government promised to spend us from the very beginning that it was ever created. It was promised from the feds that 40% of it would come to schools, and it's never even come close to that. State expenditures, these kind of things. So that's, I think, an example of where you're talking about drawing from.
That's exactly what Todd's talking about.
100%.
But I
So-
think.
yeah.
So that could almost be a separate budget category in the unrestricted reserve of, I don't know what the right word would be, but to be contributions to restricted
I think it
funds.
goes into the risk assessment of reserves, kind of like Celeste was talking about. Celeste was.
I think I think the point of setting up reserve policy is that if we say the unrestricted reserves have to be, I'm just spitballing, some minimum, some maximum, right? And then it's up to Conrad and his team to ensure that even if they have to pull money from reserves to cover special ed, that the unrestricted reserves stay in that.
But we're not
Right.
pulling unrestricted reserves to pay special ed.
Well, it should balance.
We have unrestricted revenue that should be paying for it. That's the
Oh,
terminology,
got it,
not reserve.
I see,
It's not
it's because
reserve.
okay, got it.
Well, that's seen here,
And that's really
that's seen here in the
That's really
surplus.
important. Okay, so I think
Yeah.
the point is we can still set a min-maximum for our unrestricted reserves because we should be using unrestricted revenue to cover our
Unrestricted
special ed
programs,
programs,
admin
even if it's not.
programs,
Okay,
and
that
all
was
of
it, that was very helpful.
And so-
So,
I do want to contemplate the other side of this. If you say we had a reserve policy in place that was 10%, and it's been in place. Last year, when we talked about adding the 7 period day,
Yeah.
you couldn't have done that because of the reserve unless the board acted, to not comply with their reserve. I'm just saying, there's the cost pressure of programs, negotiations, like all these other pieces that will compete. And that's part of the planning and budgeting and focus on that.
to me, that is why this policy is so important because they're always today's pressures. And the idea with reserve policy is it gives us guardrails that if we wanted to have a 7 period day and we couldn't go beyond, the minimum of the reserves, we have to have a trade-off. You know what I mean? And I think really thinking about reserves as insurance for in conjunction with the savings account, just gives you a different mental map. Like you, in your own personal budget, you wouldn't be like, I want to buy this, but I can't buy health insurance. You know what I mean? In some cases, like you need to prioritize how.
So it's like a trade-off.
Yeah, so
Saying
basically
that,
it makes
hey, we
you
want
have-
to pay for this, find something else to not do so that we can pay for this.
We always have trade-off.
Right.
That's the whole thing is we don't have infinite money, we need trade-offs, but the idea behind the reserve policy, I think, is having stronger guardrails around how low and how high our reserves can go, and that it's actually based on like a quantitative analysis of risk, so that there's reasoning behind why our reserves are at this point, and then, and then we only spend from the rest of the budget.
Right.
I think that's the reasoning behind the policy. Like, because from the board, there is a lot of pressure, but if you have a policy, it's a little,
Right.
like, everyone knows that these are the norms, I guess, or the.
And there was that one comment
Yeah.
Bill, you mentioned as far as, and you didn't use the term, but recurring revenue, you had a different word for it, but yeah. So of the revenue streams, what is recurring versus the one-time is also really important. Because the recurring, we know, taxes and stuff, that's coming every year. The one-time, that's the variability, so that's gonna have a higher risk. So that's where I really like the article and that element.
That's why the real focus on that one time is how do we spend some of it and use some of it to help get us to the balanced budget and reserve without trying to just think of more ways to spend it, as opposed to having needs and using it to spend it. So that's the conversation throughout the year about, as you're planning budget, we have 10 million in one-time funds. Do we need to spend it all? Or do we commit to something that will help us reserve and save some of that to help us get to where we're going? And it's a challenge, especially as we get into negotiations as well, as to how much do we really have to spend? How does that factor in? How do we plan for that? How do we make that all work? And I have to say, through this last year of negotiation sessions, both unions were very understanding of the financial situation that we've been in and how to move forward and how that works. But from one year to the next, that changes. And so how do we, when you have a board policy that says this and factor that, I think it's trade-offs, kind of like you said, it's trade-offs. How do we pay for this and continue to do that, but then maybe we don't do this or don't do that. And so it's how do we balance all of those things? And once you have it in policy that this needs to happen, if it's truly a guardrail, and a lot can go into the language of the policy, can provide some flexibility in the policy if that's what you want, or is it a rigid, strict policy that you must do this, period? Then it kind of ties everybody's hands a little bit more. So I think that's why the board wanted us to have these conversations. We have York and Ken in the room, we have Clancy, we have people that are going to be directly impacted by this. But we're all going to be impacted by that. And so when you make it policy, how do we kind of still allow for that planning and strategic work and the trade-off piece and in the language of the policy? So I think that was kind of that conversation of how do we get there with including all those things that we want to do.
Well, I like your idea about it when we get one-time money, if it doesn't have to be tied to a certain item. I like that idea that big one-time monies don't have to be all spent. I like that idea, and that's one example we can accumulate.
But it can't go to the reserve though, it's still restricted.
It's still restricted?
It's still restricted, it just can't,
The one-time.
it might be spent over 2 or 3 years instead of in year one.
Well, I understand
It would not go into-
because the grant is specified to certain,
Yeah,
or certain use.
the one-time stuff is almost always
But-
restricted.
Right, but you can use it strategically to pay for unrestricted things that you would have been using your unrestricted
Right, so we
dollars.
can go into the.
You can't just
restricted
transfer it
bucket.
to reserve.
Right.
You have to
they can go-
strategically work it through the budget process and have those
Yeah.
open conversations with everybody.
Restricted budget.
Yeah.
You know, ours is the restriction.
Right, I mean, essentially, you utilize those balances for unrestricted things that will allow it to then flow into, you're saving money on the unrestricted side while spending the money down on the restricted side.
Okay, I just want to take a pause for a second. It's close to 5:30. There's another item. This is really robust and positive conversation. I appreciate having it. I just want to make sure that we are cognizant of what we should be using our time for.
Yeah, this was the main
Okay, so we can keep.
the main topic, and I do wanna kind of back up and say, the plan, what I kind of committed to the board was we could use 2 sessions to come up with a recommendation. So I think this was kind of really getting some of the conversation out with maybe some direction about, we need maybe some sample more like direction on what we think I should do to help get us around the corner into the finish line on what to make a recommendation to the board on.
Let me ask a couple of questions, and I have a couple of observations on the same topic here. I'm making some assumptions. We talked about things that cause property taxes to decline, and you talked about disasters, fires or floods or things like that. When property is rebuilt after that, it's not rebenched at a new property tax rate, is it?
It depends on what the county does. Sometimes if you rebuild the same square footage on the same lot, you can make things nicer, then they won't reassess. But if you take your 2,000 square foot home and make it 5,000 square foot home, they will reassess it. So with each disaster, there's different ways. And they can delay, I think that happened recently, delaying the payment of property taxes. So, but yeah, they'll reassess if you build up.
So it depends. Another simple question is, if we set aside savings for curriculum, is that assigned balance or is it restricted?
So there's different ways you could do that. I believe we could set aside money in restricted lottery for curriculum. Certain restricted programs would pay for curriculum, but for the most part, generally, it would be setting aside unrestricted dollars for curriculum.
And
I don't know how we've done it.
if we were doing that in a big way, it might look like something like the 1.786.
For the 7th period day.
7th period day.
Yeah.
It's assigned, but it's still unrestricted.
Yeah.
Some portion of it.
Right. It's a GASB a long time ago that broke out reserves into 5 categories and assigned this kind of the least restricted before you get to community.
The next question is something I believe I know. I just want to make sure we're all sharing this. That when we talked about the state minimum of 3% reserve, is that is unrestricted reserve amount, correct? And is that in the 3rd year that it needs to be?
All 3 years on your multi-year projection.
Not just this year, it's all 3 years,
Correct.
okay.
To certify your budget, the county reviews that all 3 years have to be above 3%.
And now I'm going to acknowledge that I didn't get a chance to read the GFOAO article. Was the color codes that were created with the ranges, was that from that article, or were those something that you put together? What was the source of the ranges that we went with particular colors?
That's something that I did.
Okay.
Based on, I mean, those ranges are GFOA recommended ranges.
Okay.
And SSC, they all kind of are around those categories. I kind of applied the different categories, and I know people like colors. I've been told I'm a little too bland in my slides sometimes.
And blue is the most common. So, and now an observation about the idea of linking balanced budget and reserve policy. I think I think you're absolutely right. This is a critical part of what has to happen. But isn't it true that if you had a reserve of 30% and the next year you had a reserve of 30%, that's a balanced budget, presuming that the expenditures stay within it. You can.
Well, not necessarily, because if your expenditures went down, you know, that formula, you can end up with the same percent and the numbers can fluctuate.
But balanced budget means that you're spending the amount that you're bringing in.
Revenues equal expenditures. That's the concept of balanced budget.
And in a year that if we had a balanced budget, and I know that's not the recommendation, but if we had a balanced budget policy, in a year that we weren't able to meet that criteria and had to go into reserves because of emergency or something like that, then the reserve number would be going down potentially.
Depends on the expense number.
Right.
The
Yeah.
expense number goes up.
If the expense goes up and your reserve dollar amount stays the same, the percentage goes
I
down.
guess I'm living in the savings account versus checking account
Right.
kind of world. But if I have $10 in my savings account and I need $9, if I buy this, it's going to cost me $9. This toy that I want, this a one-time expenditure. That's a very different calculus to me emotionally and to my fiscal health than if I had $100 in my savings account and wanted to dig in by $9. And so I'm wondering about, I think part of the conversation in terms of setting a reserve is we should probably be aware of what the emotions of having exceptionally large reserves look like in terms of, oh, well, we can afford this because we have the savings. But we may not say, yeah, we can afford to buy this elephant, but we won't be able to feed it. So I think somewhere in there, I love that we're talking about this. I also think that if you have a very strict policy with the guardrails that you talked about, there will be pressures to say, oh, well, we can do something about that. That's what the reserve is for, question. How do we build a policy that says this is a reserve, but acknowledges the fact that human beings will be sitting at the table saying, oh, well, we can do that, or we really need to do that. We've got to honor our staff.
Which
We've
they
got
did.
to do all these things, right?
Which is
Yeah.
why we have no reserves left.
I mean.
Right.
Well, so I do think that having the reserve will create a new environment if it's set. At one point, I think I heard Gabe say at a meeting that he thought that there was already a policy that said that we had a 10% reserve. And I don't think there ever was, but I think it was a common understanding, or at least expectation.
I think though, also, one thing that you have really done on board is that now we go back to our policies and we're really following our policies. And then if we have a problem with a policy, we talk about changing it.
Right.
As opposed to, if we believe there is a 10% policy, but we did something anyway, that is not the right process.
Right.
The governance process,
Well, and policy isn't law either, so I think
it's
the part.
within our district.
I think what I'm going to argue for is that if we set these kind of reserves, that we probably need to have something in terms of policy or administrative regulation that says, how do you make an exception? What causes the ability to
And that was one of the things
question, actually, is when.
the GFOA,
number 4.
Number four,
provided that.
Like it really talked on all the critical elements
Absolutely.
and kept everything in a box. But if you followed that, you probably have something like guardrails for a long time.
And I think, my understanding is the reason you might want a balanced budget, well, correct me if I'm wrong, a balanced budget policy is basically the policy would say that recurring expenses must be funded by recurring revenues. And so it basically is a second guardrail, is that right? I mean, why you would want both?
I would,
Because otherwise you can have
yeah,
I think it's also,
a balanced budget for 1 year, but then,
I would consider that mostly for the unrestricted side of the budget. Like the unrestricted side should balance, we should have a balanced budget on the unrestricted side, where the restricted kind of ebbs and flows with the cash flows. I mean, even the federal government, their year is different, and so when you get to the fiscal years, you end up with moving this to there and that to there, that gets a little more complicated. I don't know that would be part of this policy, maybe new language, or be a separate policy, or somehow.
I think it has to be somehow linked.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it would be two policies, like a balanced budget policy and then a reserve policy.
Yes.
Well, and what the board has asked for and what we're talking about today is not the combination of those things, but I think one of the things that could come out of this discussion is, in terms of recommendation, is that the next step in doing this? And the other question is, can we legitimately set a percentage goal for a reserve policy without a linked, balanced budget policy? I don't know the answer to that. But
Or if you set a reserve policy, you're gonna fail the first year if you don't have a balanced budget. That's all. That's why they have to be.
And then what happens when you do? I think that's kind of part of it.
But I do think it's relevant to rethink how I know we have to have a budget a certain way, but I'm gonna go back to the example, we get $10 million in 1 year. So I like when you said unrestricted, although I don't really totally carve it out. But if you've got a $9 million surplus 1 year, you can't use that same gap methodology and have a negative $9 million the next year deficit. And then say, oh, it's not balanced because it
Right.
really was.
That's why that's on the restricted side.
Yep,
I would have preferred, because the state allows for you, for some restricted accounts, on unearned revenue. So the revenue follows the year where it's spent. That would make more sense. Others, most of them, they just fund balance, and so it just falls into fund balance, and you end up with these deficit
yeah, so I think
situations.
that should be clear, so it's not confusing.
Right.
Of what balance means.
Right.
I think it would be helpful too, Conrad, at least, and maybe everyone else can chime in as well, like for these numbers for 24 and 25, 26, what portion of the restricted expenses were covered by restricted funds, either restricted revenue or restricted reserves? Because just for last year, of the 48.8 million deficit, 40 million came from unrestricted.
So
Only 8 million came from,
where did you pull the numbers from?
just from the
From
latest.
the budget books?
Just from the latest budget.
Okay.
And it all flips out like in a backside.
Yeah, well, sure.
It's just misleading, that's all.
Yeah,
I get it, but it's just, it'd be, if
But
we
what
could
you
truly
asked-
understand,
But what
like,
you ask for, that is what you need to be able to understand.
because if there's a big portion that's like the special education, which isn't funded by restricted money, and it has to be funded unrestricted, so it's truly almost like an unrestricted expense, but it falls under restricted.
There's lots of,
I think for us, if we're setting a goal for unrestricted reserves, but so much of the surplus, all of it gets eaten up by restricted. And thus, like right now, we have a $28 million surplus of
there should
unrestricted.
be separate.
That would normally increase our unrestricted reserve, but it doesn't because it all gets eaten up by restricted.
Yeah.
So if we could like calculate and know exactly, why is so little of the restricted deficit being funded by restricted reserves?
But we are eating into the unrestricted, like.
Oh, yeah, like
So we know.
11.6 million this year, 9.6 million last year.
Yeah, so the concept of the balanced budget does need to happen. But
At a minimum.
it's gotta be, we gotta split it,
right.
because that,
And this,
That
the result of
restricted
all of
goes
this
forward.
is gonna have a direct impact on how we budget. 1 year to the next, and just what we can include, what we cannot include, how do we assess what we're doing, like all of those things. The end result of this is gonna really dictate what we can and cannot do. And so from a budgetary standpoint. And so that's why this is almost sets the target of like, we have to make sure we stay within that range as we develop the budget, which is difficult to do as all the different pieces are working on their budget, and then to bring them together and to put them and see their impact on reserve. And or each individual comes to us balanced, but not all of these departments have revenue. Most of our district doesn't have revenue. It's one big bucket of revenue that's used by many. If it was easier, it'd be small companies that all have to bring a balanced budget in, that would make it a lot easier.
no, but all that, the tax money is all unrestricted.
Right,
So that's spread across everything.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unrestricted
Right.
revenue. So the restriction's pretty easy, because that's concrete. When there's one time, I absolutely think strategically, what can it pay for that we don't have to use unrestricted for to start working
Right.
on that surplus? But you have to have those buckets really easy to see.
yeah,
Yeah, and unrestricted is not just admin, it's like, it's the programs, the teachers too, I mean, that's a big sense of our revenue.
everything. Not everything, but everything unrestricted. So I guess, how do we get to where we need to get to with this? What do we think our next steps would be in drafting something to start working on that I can bring back, that we can all look at something concrete and tangible to say, this is what we're gonna recommend. Like, how do we get it?
So I think the questions from the article that talked about the risk analysis. So 2 months of cash is one way to look at it, but again, if maybe we really need 4 months of cash. Or maybe the cash metric is we've got so much recurring revenue, it's really the unrestricted or these revenue streams that are at risk. That's the percentage we need to look at. And so having that risk analysis, I think, would be important. But we need to answer these questions.
So my question is, with the risk analysis, they have a template that you do in-house? Or is that the starting point to use the template?
If you have a template, sure.
They have like GFOA, it's on page 12, they have a template that, the template, it says a qualitative or subjective risk analysis is the most accessible approach. Where you assess your exposure in each category and consider if reserve targets accommodate that exposure. So that's like an easy step versus having a more formalized risk analysis.
Conrad, did you look at the template?
I didn't open the template, I saw the link to it.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
Because some
I take a look
templates are
at it.
great, some not so great.
Right,
I wanna go back to the concern or the expectation that the committee is making recommendations that require additional work and things from the business department. And I think what I would want to know, Conrad, is what is your recommendation for moving from this broad kind of energetic conversation about doing all kinds of things to create change that make the budget process different? What's doable? What should our next recommendation be that acknowledges the fact that that we don't have unlimited time and people resources to turn everything upside down at this point?
Well, I want to get us to a point that we can come up with some language for a policy.
I think
And maybe even if we leave the percentages out and have the language and then come do an assessment to get to the percentages, to the window, the kind of the min max. I think because the language of it is going to be very impactful to everybody. Instead of just a one line saying, here's, our reserve will be between this and that. I think
X
it needs to be
percent.
deeper than-
The worst answer is just a flat number without all of it.
Okay.
yeah,
I think
So
so.
we skip the analysis and just pick numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do that.
No.
I personally.
I want to think about the language. And I want everybody's thoughts on the language to be included, because it can't necessarily, and I look at our folks over here too, it can't just, be the financial side without considering the operational and program side. Like, we have to bring everybody's, that's why I like this conversation for this group, because we need to have all of those thoughts in the room, kind of participating in that, if you care. I mean, honestly, I'm just kind of looking to make sure you're.
I think we need to make sure we're doing that sort of risk analysis to figure out those percentages, because when I hear we need 2 months of whatever in our reserves, my question is why?
yes.
And when I hear for a disaster,
What's the likelihood?
what is the likelihood? How often does the state of California step in? Do we actually receive those? Like, I just don't know all of those things, right? And so when I hear over 14%, I think that is a very high number when we have a number of employees who are working multiple jobs to be able to live here. And that is a problem to me. If that money is just going to sit there from year to year, why aren't we getting that to people working with students, to services, to programs?
Because it goes down every year, then you end up with nothing.
Well, I
But
So,
if we're trying to build it up for it to just sit there,
but it will always have to sit there, just like you have your savings account for your family. It will probably sit there for 20 years and you may
but
never need it.
the analogy of a savings account is different because of how complex a school district is. And so that's where I want to understand what those differences are, so that when I see a percentage of the reserve, I understand why that is
Which
necessary.
is 1 and 2 up there.
Well, I
It should
think,
be articulated.
I think-
agree with that, there should be the why behind it. I can give you 1,000 whys, but we should have it documented, because it's not documented right now, and I think it's a misnomer. Because it does seem like, oh my gosh, we've got $14 million. There's extra money, and several years ago, we had more, $30 million, and so it's gone. And now the concept is it's gone every single year more, and now it's going down. And if we continue at 5 million, all of a sudden we have nothing, and then the school closes. So you have to have at least a minimum, and what should that minimum be? So that California says 3%, and if it's 2.9, we're gonna come in and shut you down. But there are things that, we had every organization puts together contingency surplus. It's usually invested so that you're making money that goes back into operations. So we should be making $1 million a year at least, which should be funding the programs and things. So it's not just sitting there. But if we have this defined as to, in this situation, and in this situation, we pull a little bit and it toggles, that's what it should be used for. So it fluctuates a little bit, but so it can't be nothing.
I mean, I hear what you're saying in terms of not giving Conrad too much work, but I think what York is saying, that he wants to know that the percentages have real meaning. Is that what you're saying? That basically that the numbers don't come out of nowhere, that it's just 2 months of expenses, like an analysis would actually be helpful, because if we were like, okay, a fire is very low probability, but high impact, we should weight it at 1% or something of the damage, you come up with an actual percentage number that has reasoning behind it, which is what Diana's saying. Is that what you're, just when you just say there's a pot of money and there's no reason, that's why I think Conrad's time spent doing this analysis is actually very well spent, because otherwise, no one understands why these reserves exist. And
Well,
what
like what was in this
Yeah.
was very much about
Yeah.
this transparency and
Yes,
more
exactly. I
community
think that's what
members
York is saying.
understand
Yes.
why the reserve is what it is. If you have a policy that risk weights everything and people
Yes.
can understand that makes sense or doesn't make sense, I think you make a great point. I think
Yes.
that's what we're trying to get to.
So in
So we
terms
may,
of,
we may find out 14% is not.
Right, yeah, right, but we don't wanna make it up, I think is your point, yeah.
so in terms of, and I don't know, this might be totally oversimplifying it, is in terms of an actionable step, is there a way to understand, what would that need to look like to do the risk assessment and to get that? What does that look like in terms of, is it just Conrad doing that? Is it, what would that entail to do that?
And maybe you want to
I
come
have to
back
look
to us
at it, I
and
haven't looked at it.
maybe you could just come back to the committee and say,
I can share it with the committee, to see, I haven't opened the link, so I have no idea. Would it be 10 minutes, or would it be 3 hours, I couldn't tell you, I can't commit to it.
I didn't know if it was something that just you do, or if it's something that.
I think it needs to start with Conrad.
and then, I mean,
I want to be careful with saying that we don't have the authority to say what Conrad can and can't do. We were charged with bringing a recommendation back about reserve policy. And in order for us to do that, we need more information, which is going to have impact on what we're asking you to do. So I'm a little concerned with how this all goes, but I don't know how else we get someplace.
Right.
I mean, to me, it seems like if Conrad looks at it and what the committee is saying, I mean, we haven't taken a vote, but I hear York, for example, and Todd and Diana saying an analysis would help. Conrad looks at it, and if he has to go back to the board, do you think you have to go back to the board and say, the whole committee recommends that we do this analysis and that Conrad spends his time in this way? Is that how?
I think that's really anything that requires directing a division or employees to do something can't come from the committee, it has to come from
We're not
the-
directing, we need the information, so however we get it. We
So I
can
guess
do
we
work,
could, we
but
could
I
vote
agree with
next
York
time.
that we need this information, and we all seem to be on the same page of, we do need some sort of, we want the why behind it versus picking a number.
Can I make a suggestion? I
Yeah.
think, Conrad, you said that this is something you thought was gonna need two meetings for us to discuss.
Right.
What would you anticipate bringing back in the next in the next meeting that would help us continue this conversation?
Well, I was gonna see how this meeting went, what the conversation was like, what, what kind of, how far we got with it. And my thought would have been for the next meeting to really be drafting language for it. So I think the risk assessment, like I said, I could look at it and in 5 minutes tell you if it's gonna take me 20 minutes or 10 hours.
Or with a dumb template and not worth anything.
Right, it may not even be something we're doing, but I think, I don't know how we get back to the, we're being asked to propose policy language. Or at least concepts of what that language should look for. Maybe it's not the specific language, it's like, here's what we think should be considered in the policy. And then push back on the board to say, okay, we think these 3 things need to be in the policy. And maybe the board then comes up with the language. I don't know, because we don't make policy, but we can propose the specifics of what should be in it.
We need to propose to the board the things that need to be considered in the policy. They will
Yes.
decide those things. And if that requires work, then that will be approval through our superintendent.
So maybe through this meeting and the conversation that we've had, I agree. We all maybe now have some ideas of what we think should be included. So maybe we kind of bring those back to the next meeting, we put them all up and we start compiling something to make sure we have something to bring back. Maybe that's the result and that's what the next meeting looks like. Of all the thoughts of everybody, you don't have to have thoughts, but that's what this group, we're asking for everybody's thoughts. And then the next meeting can be working on compiling, ranking, compiling, and getting all the ideas.
Yeah, so this risk analysis, you'd be looking at things such as this 14%, that could be maybe 10%. But in other areas, would you be looking at that kind of thing as well? Because, you guys brought out an example of maybe not needing 14%. Maybe we have.
Maybe we need 20% though. Could go.
Or it could be 20%, but that would be part of the analysis.
Right.
But again, the thing is that, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to use it somewhere, but if, there's areas where we can see if it's not more and if it's less, there could be other examples of that. And I'm just saying, if that's part of that whole risk analysis.
Right, and maybe the risk analysis will help us get to the percentages. Because if it's gonna help us get to the percentages, I think it's gonna be a little involved. And so I can come back, I can look at it and see, maybe it's applying risk factors to certain things in the area. But it's also based, that article was based on local governments and not necessarily schools.
Oh, it also.
So I think, I didn't know if there was a school piece to it, but I know it started, a lot of it was, it's the same kind of accounting, but there's, in a risk assessment, schools have some different nuances than local governments.
Some of the authors were involved with school districts.
Okay.
So.
We also have like a track record, right? For the last 4 or 5 years, we know from first interim to second to final, where we started and where we ended and how that changes over time. And we also can look at all the revenue line items and the expense line items. And we can say, so 85% of expenses is pretty much known, right? And that's like, there's not much risk to that. And 80% of the revenue is pretty much known, and we can give those like no risk weights. And so if we're really dealing everything on the margin, and we have 4 or 5 years and we know what the standard deviation of where we've been off, that can help us, I think, do it. And so I think the template's interesting, and then maybe the last 5 years of, the deviation of where we've missed in terms of forecasting, and then what line items are the primary drivers of that, and that's where maybe we apply high risk factors.
I was just, so is the policy, when you keep coming back to this, of developing language, is it looking more to have policy that's speaking to the things that are going into it and not necessarily arriving at a actual percent, but like an actual, like, we don't want to be below this or we want to, you know what I mean? Like, is it an actual number, or would that be something that we would eventually get to, but the policy is more
Well, I think that's kind of what we talked about, like maybe we kind of thought, what I've heard is the range may be the best idea. That in and itself is progress toward this project, right?
Yes.
Because I think initially we thought it was one number, but we seem to have all kind of said, hey, maybe a range is better. So that's progress getting to that, and then kind of filling out the other pieces. Does that make sense?
Yes.
The board policy could also say like, you know, annually, we need to do a risk assessment,
Right,
and the
that's
risk
what I wanted.
assessment will determine, and then we could have the AR that then maybe narrows down that
That's what I
percentage,
wanted.
maybe changes
Right.
annually.
Yeah.
But the board
Or
policy
annually
stays
we
the
can
same.
decide
Yeah.
to. So we
Or
don't
every
necessarily-
4 years
Yeah.
or something, we reassess.
But and you
I like that.
acknowledge the difference between policy and administrative regulation. Policy sets standards. Administrative regulations are the acts that it takes to implement those standards. So policy can be a lot more broad and grandiose, and then, well, this is what it really gets down to. And at some point, we're gonna have to say, yeah, well, if everything goes according to plan, we're gonna be at 6 point something, 7 point something. If we have any number that's higher than that, then the administrative regulation or direction needs to be not about, we will have a 10% reserve, it's we will work to get to it through X, Y, and Z steps.
Right, and maybe this is a combination of recommendation for board policy and the administrative regulation, which is where the detail would be to kind of enforce the board policy. So the board policy being higher level, referring to the administrative regulation, which would set the procedure. So I think this has been a really good conversation. I know for you non-financial people, it must be like, what are these people, why do they even do this? But I appreciate having you here. It's important to have everybody here. I think we did make some process, so if you can think about that, maybe even tonight or soon, since the conversation is fresh, just jot a couple things down that you think would be good to have part of this. And then so for the next meeting, we can really put something together that we can bring back.
Do you anticipate some sort of a report to the board at the next next board meeting?
Next Tuesday?
Yeah.
I think I tried to set the expectation, it's gonna take us.
We may be limited in terms of who's in attendance.
Right.
And then one question I have is Diana had the thought about having a clear report of restricted.
I'm just gonna send comment, but I do.
Yeah.
So we just use it.
Great.
I see,
Great.
okay, so there's no action item.
No. And the only other agenda item we had was if there was questions or comments on the TRAN and the adopted budget. I hope you look at the TRAN one, I'm really proud of what we did there. Instead of going out for 23 million, we kind of reassessed and looked at the cash flows, went out for 16 million. The S&P Standard & Poor's gave us the highest possible rating for short-term instruments that we could get. And that was a lot of work. I had to do an interview with them and it was a process, but our consulting was great. So the cost of the borrowing is less. When we got a rate that's lower than what we're going to make on that money sitting there. So I think it all ended up pretty good. That attachment I sent you kind of gets into the weeds a little bit, but there's a lot of good information. I was really happy that Standard & Poor's looked at kind of what they look at. It's an area, but they weren't necessarily significantly alarmed, and they thought for the 1 year, we will be able to pay this back. And so I thought that ended up much better than we initially planned. So I just wanted to take a little credit.
That was a great
Because Lacey really helped with the cash flows, did a fantastic job, and we really worked hard to try to get that.
And I also want to make a suggestion for anybody that, I guess it may only be the two of you, but on Friday, the welcome back activity at the Arlington Theater for the entire district staff was really, I think, one of the best that I've seen. And the district chose not to spend money on a high expense motivational speaker. Instead, we had 4 student speakers who were just phenomenal. And it wasn't just happy talk, it was honest assessment of what those students have seen, good and bad, in their district. There were remarkable performances by musicians, from kids that were just barely beginning and performing mariachi with a young guy that is gonna be a singer the world will know.
He was amazing.
And he's only going into 8th grade.
Wow.
Just amazing.
Seriously, I was blown away. The first note that came out of his mouth, I was like, oh my gosh. But thanks for bringing that up, Bill. That was a great.
And, you know, the introductory comments from the superintendent where she actually, I think revealed some really personal things about her life and her story. Take a look at the video if you will. I think look at some of what went on. There are really remarkable things happening in the district. And as we look at the challenges and the problems and the tensions here and there and whatever's going on, the truth is there is wonderful stuff happening here. And part of it is dealing with the difficulty of how to bring this committee to productive work to help with what's going on. And I appreciate that all of you are here today and just want to say thank you and
Thank you
back
all.
to the beginning of the year where everybody's happy and it's a renewal. So let's keep it that way as much as we can.
All right.
Can we do the official meeting adjourned?
We'll adjourn at
6:03.
6:03. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.